Hi, everyone, and welcome to week 8. I hope you all had a great reading week and had some time to relax, take a little break from your studies. I thought now that we're in the second half of the course, I would give a brief update. I think the accountability assignments so far have generally been okay. Some have been absolutely excellent, and I'm sure those who've done excellent know who they are. The average in the course is currently in the low 70s, which is quite good, very normal. So I'm not too worried about everyone falling behind. There are, however, some issues that are consistent with some of the assignments. There are some major issues with properly citing materials according to the APA guidelines. Many of you need to make sure that you appropriately cite all the materials you use in your assignments according to the APA guidelines. And I've been assured by the department that all of you have training in APA in previous courses and previous semesters. So you should all be familiar with APA, and hopefully no one loses any marks going forward for not following these guidelines. Um, there have been a few cases of minor cases of plagiarism. I haven't flagged any of these yet to the department because I'm assuming that hopefully these are accidents. However, going forward, I will have to be looking at this very, very carefully. So if you are uncertain about your familiarity with APA and worried that you might be perhaps plagiarizing even unintentionally, I'd recommend reviewing these guidelines in detail. Remember, a major component of the assignment is also showing me that you have read and digested the course materials and done the readings. So it's very important that you try to display this in your assignments as well, because there's very flowery language and sentences that don't really contribute much analytically. Makes it very difficult for me to give a high grade, because the intention here is that you show me that you've done the course work, you've done the readings. So it's very important that you try to display that. And sometimes you don't even have to, in these assignments, do your own research. You could very much lean on a lot of the research that I've already provided to you. You just have to read the course materials, and you can use that in the assignments as well. So also, small note, from this point forward, if the academic honesty statement is not attached to the assignment, I will not be accepting the assignment for grading. The 5% deduction in the grade that I've used up until now um, has not prevented many students from still forgetting to attach the academic honesty statement. Um, so I hope this serves as a final warning. Remember, this is not my policy, it's the college's policy. I will also not be accepting any late assignments or assignments missing the accountability statement. So late assignments and those missing the accountability statement will not be accepted any further, and it will get a 0 grade unless there's a doctor's note provided saying that you were unable to do the assignment due to some sort of medical emergency. Saying you forgot to email to put the academic honesty statement and emailing me, that will no longer suffice. So um, there's no even a bother to send me the email with the honesty statement after the assignment is submitted. It is already too late. So please make sure you copy and paste the honesty statement to the assignment that you submit to turn it in. Um, it will not matter anymore if you send me an email after the fact saying you forgot and send me the statement. I will not be able to accept. It seems that many of you are also doing the assignments kind of last minute. There are many grammatical errors. Some of the analysis can be quite weak in some of these assignments, especially tapering off near the end or the final questions, which kind of indicates that perhaps some of you are leaving this to last minute. So I recommend displaying that you've read and watched the course materials, using the vocabulary and concepts that I've discussed in the course materials, as it's very obvious to the reader when I'm looking over the assignments if a student has not taken any look at the materials that I've assigned. Um, it is, like I said, it is possible to get an A on a assignment using almost entirely the materials that I've provided to you. So today, without any further ado, I hope that clarifies a lot of this for many of you. But today we'll spend a little time on political globalization and the issues with globalization, specifically how these issues have contributed to the rise of the anti-globalization movement. So today, the agenda today is we'll discuss the WTO. Briefly discuss its history. I'm sure many of you already know that our history, our overviews of history are quite brief. So if you're interested in the history of the WTO as an organization, I recommend you look into it further or look at the materials I've assigned. We'll look at the anti-globalization movement. Things to think about near the end, big questions that are very relevant to this topic. And we'll discuss briefly again the accountability assignment for this week, which you'll have due on Friday. So as I mentioned, we will be discussing political globalization. However, when we discuss the WTO, this clearly intersects or is directly linked to economic globalization as well. We will look at the impact globalization has had, as well as the backlash to this phenomenon. The debate between pro-globalization and anti-globalization is one which very much will shape the future of geopolitics. There are those on the right who are both for and against globalization. There are also those on the left who are both for and anti-globalization. The right and left of the political spectrum, of course. So this issue, in many ways, transcends traditional political ideological divisions. Excuse me. For example, there are those on the right who oppose globalization and its various institutions, such as the UN and the WTO, and promote a form of nationalism or autarky in its place. Similarly, there are those on the far left who oppose the rise of multinational corporations and the rise of transnational capitalist elites, and understand these as an exploitative force against workers both in the global north and global south, sometimes just called the developing and the developed world. So both left and right have this criticism of globalization. The prescriptions that they offer are quite different. The far left would prescribe politically a form of nationalism or isolationism as a response to globalization or the forces of contemporary globalization, specifically the institutions such as the WTO, but would rather promote a form of solidarity that transcends borders and nation states. This is quite different than the far right or the right. It is clear, however, that there's no going back, and globalization is a phenomenon that will continue in the future, regardless of what we think about it. So some would say that there's no putting the genie back in the bottle, would be the term that some have used to describe this phenomenon, that there's globalization is a force that's here to stay in global politics. So it's important to recognize that no side is entirely correct when we discuss this phenomenon of globalization. There are those, for example, who are entirely pro-globalization and claim that there's no downsides. If you would make this claim, you'd be missing the various ways in which globalization actually has negatively impacted workers and societies around the globe. For example, the deterioration of the manufacturing sector in the United States, as well as the exploitation of cheap labor by multinational corporations in the global south, sometimes called the developing world as well. Even here in Canada, the auto sector has struggled due to this, and has caused a great deal of suffering for those workers once employed by these companies, which moved elsewhere because of the strength of labor and the high wages that are found in Western states such as Canada. Similarly, if one regards everything about globalization as bad, This is also unfair. Amazing organizations and institutions have provided or attempted to provide things such as universal human rights, human security, a decent standard of living, labor rights. These are also a product of global cooperation that we see in the era of globalization. Um, but that being said, we can also see very clearly how global institutions, like we discussed last week, such as the IMF, can cause a great deal of harm as well, as the conditions placed upon countries when they receive funding from these international institutions can sometimes stifle the development and force countries and their citizens to make enormous sacrifices to their social services and their often already limited welfare state. I think that some of the videos I posted last week make this quite clear, and some of the readings. So I recommend taking a look at that as well, if you haven't already. There are clearly people who are better off due to globalization, as well as those who are worse off due to these processes. So part of what we need to do is acknowledge the good and bad dimensions of this phenomenon. It's a major task for states and other political and economic institutions in the future to minimize the harm, or sometimes referred to as the externalities caused by globalization, and instead maximize the positive aspects and the potential benefits of globalization in the 21st century. Like most geopolitical issues, there are ways to mitigate the bad and emphasize the good. Much like the internet, there are aspects we can see that are clearly beneficial, but also aspects which can cause a great deal of societal harm. Needless to say, we should not eliminate the internet because of its various issues, cybercrime, misinformation, etc. Rather, we all, as a society, need to figure out how to manage this phenomenon and make sure its positive potential is fully realized. So I would not recommend saying something like, everything about globalization is good or everything about globalization is bad in your assignments, but rather to embrace some of the complexity when you emphasize the aspects which you believe are good or negative. It's impossible to ignore globalization or turn back the clock to a previous era prior to globalization. So it's important to take seriously those who are opposed to globalization and address their legitimate concerns and fears about this phenomenon, because these are legitimate concerns and fears, because as we can see, there's been some unevenness in the benefits that have been of globalization, as well as an uneven situation where much of the harms caused by globalization have weighed on certain individuals as well. So we have to be conscious of this, right? Okay, moving on. So the WTO, the World Trade Organization, was founded in 1995. So when we compare it to the UN, that comes out of the late 40s, or the EU, that has its origins in the 1950s, or even the beginnings of NAFTA in the 1980s, the WTO is a relatively new organization, less than about 30 years old. That being said, the genesis of the WTO goes way back to around the Second World War, right after the Second World War. And that is the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, or GATT, which was from 1948 to 1994. And this was the institution that was prior to the development of the WTO. So let's take a little bit and talk about the GATT. These were the first rules to govern global trade. Before this time, the rules of global trade were between individual nation states and based largely on hard power. If one country was able to exploit another because it was more powerful or richer, or able to intimidate militarily, or use trade as a carrot to entice cooperation with another state, then the nation states would do this. If they wanted to punish another state, they would also do this through trade. Basically, what was in existence following the Second World War was a world of very high tariffs. Well, you might be asking, what is a tariff? Well, a tariff is a tax on a good imported into a country. This would make a foreign good much more expensive than a local good. For example, if a lawnmower that costs and is sold at $100 locally, but a similar foreign quality made toaster or a lawnmower, it could be a lawnmower, it could be a toaster. Let's go back and say, uh, let's say a toaster costs $100 locally and is sold and made at $100 locally. But a foreign toaster, which was produced through cheaper rent and labor in a foreign country, can be sold at $90, then one would surely, as a consumer, be enticed to buy the foreign toaster. However, this would put the local toaster business out of business, right? The local toaster manufacturer. So countries would put taxes or tariffs on the cheaper foreign goods. So if you put a $20 tariff on a foreign good, for instance, let's say we were talking about toasters, and the toaster was $90 originally, the foreign toaster, and you put a $20 tariff on it, that would make it $110. So the foreign toaster would be $90 plus a $20 tariff. And so now there'd be an incentive for the local community to buy the $100 toaster rather than the $110 foreign toaster that was foreign made, right? So anytime you see a tariff placed on a good, it is a tax that's paid by the consumer. It is designed to make the consumer pay more money for the foreign good. The producer doesn't pay. Rather, it's the consumer that pays. So this is what the world looked like after World War II, where every country was very protectionist over their own local industries, whether it's lumber, wheat, sugar, coffee, cars, washing machines, etc. Any good coming into the country was facing high tariffs, which you can obviously see is not great for global trade, as people will be enticed to buy the local good rather than pay the high tariffs for the foreign good, right? So what the GATT was in 1948 to 1994 was a set of principles which were designed to encourage and speed up international trade. Basically, if you wanted to participate in the global economy, you had to sign on to this agreement, or eventually what became a series of agreements. There's not just one GATT, but rather a series of GATT. What the GATT did was encourage free trade, remove quotas, and limit tariffs. You might be asking what a quota is. So a quota is a set of limits on imports. So sometimes there were situations that would allow local car makers to make and sell as many cars as they want, right? So if you're a local car manufacturer, you can make and sell as many cars you want locally or domestically. Whereas they would set limits on how many foreign car makers could be, how many foreign cars could be imported and sold yearly into your country. So foreign made vehicles. So for example, a foreign car company might only be allowed to send about 10,000 cars a year. I'm sure you all remember from your econ classes how this limited supply and higher demand would raise the cost of the foreign car. So in this sense, a quota is a tariff without actually kind of being a tariff, right? Because the limited supply would raise the price. So GATT and its set of agreements was designed to get rid of these tariffs so that free trade could persist without an artificial tax being added to the goods and remove quotas on how much of a particular good could be imported. So a major issue with GATT is that it was a set of agreements without any mechanism to enforce these agreements. This meant that countries sidestepped these agreements whenever it was convenient for them. While it was limiting tariffs and quotas, it was not eliminating tariffs and quotas. So it was often, because there was no teeth to the GATT or enforcement mechanism, there was lots of sidestepping. So the WTO, the World Trade Organization, replaced the GATT in 1995. The rules of the GATT, its intention to promote free trade, globalization, international trade, were acknowledged as a good development, right? However, there was no mechanism to enforce its rules. And there was no body or global organization which countries could meet, discuss, deliberate over these treaties. At this point, about 164 countries in the world have signed on to these rules and agreed to operate under this set of rules. So unlike the GATT, the WTO has a dispute resolution body. So you can actually take another country to the WTO if a country does not follow the rules of the WTO, and the WTO will investigate and you can deliberate over these issues. While not always living up to its goals, the idea of the WTO was that there would be no discrimination against local goods, right? Or against foreign goods, I'm sorry. No discrimination against foreign goods. So it would be a free trade regime. There would be no discrimination against foreign goods that were imported to each country or export. Great. So there are exceptions for the WTO, and these exceptions are sometimes exploited by states. There are two areas in which it is widely accepted that tariffs or quotas are acceptable. For example, if that product is environmentally damaging, or a good that a state must protect, or an industry that the state must protect as part of their national security interests. And in these cases, it'd be appropriate for states, or seen as appropriate, to impose tariffs or quotas. However, this becomes a sticky issue, as it is often difficult to what accounts as an environmental or national security issue, as these categories are quite broad. You might be asking, the concept of national security issue is one we've discussed. It can mean a whole variety of things. So this is a bit of a controversial issue. The WTO has a large staff of economists and trade experts that are paid through the dues paid from each country into the WTO as an organization. How much dues they pay is based on how much they trade in the world. So a major trading country will pay more to the WTO, which goes to pay economists, experts who provide information, write reports, and keep track and keep tabs on the world trade system. Unlike the UN, that's based in New York, Switzerland, and other places, the WTO only has one single location, and that's in Geneva, Switzerland. World leaders must agree on the WTO rules about every 2 years, so that every 2 years they meet to discuss the rules for global trade. At times, this has been difficult as there are more poor countries in the world than rich countries. So at times when they get together, rich countries become very concerned about what rules on trade that poor countries will seek to place, specifically on rich countries, in order to shrink the gap between rich and poor globally. And historically, some states have gotten so frustrated with the WTO, they simply leave the meetings and fly home when things don't go the way that they would like them to. So it is kind of there are tensions within this institution as well. Unsurprisingly, with so many of the agreements going back all the way to the GATT in 1948, the WTO has over 30,000 pages of agreements and trade rules. So obviously, this requires many economists and experts at the WTO. They're needed there just to understand the rules. One of the most important things that comes out of the WTO is the development of the most favored nation status, which means that if you give preferential treatment to one country on trade, you must offer the same treatment to the rest of the WTO countries. So let's say Canada lowered its tariffs to Bolivia for a particular good or service. And Canada didn't have a free trade agreement with Bolivia. the rest of the WTO states must also be offered that deal for that good or service. And this is why we've seen a growth in free trade agreements between countries, which are beyond the most favored nation status. This goes beyond cutting tariffs, but moves towards a completely free trade regime, as there are in the European Union or whereas under NAFTA. In such an agreement, you do not need to give all trade partners the same deal as you give those within the agreement. For example, Germany has no quotas or tariffs for goods from Italy, but Egypt, which doesn't have a free trade agreement and wishes for the same deal, they are not entitled to this because the EU supersedes the most favored nation status. But if Germany signed an agreement to lower tariffs on some Egyptian goods alone, the countries around Egypt could claim most favored nation status and ask for the same deal. So the trade agreements, the trade organizations and the trade agreements between countries supersedes the most favored nation status. But the most favored nation status sets a floor for trade relations between countries globally. So we will end there for part one. And in part two, we will come back and discuss the issues affecting globalization today, as well as the anti-globalization movement. So we will see you all in part two.